Chapter 9 is entitled Mendelssohn's Assimilationist Heresies. It was par for the course in the Illuminati, as well as the Communist Party of today, that second-rate performers would get star billing. It has been said that the communist conspiracy offers to its recruits and collaborators more than just a foothold for total power. For those evil and ruthless and unscrupulous instances to serve it, the conspiracy offers great and immediate rewards. An unprincipled and second-rate professor is made a college president, a scheming bureaucrat becomes a senator, an unknown but useful singer is catapulted into international stardom. As we zero in on Mendelssohn's life, we find that his innermost circle is dominated by Nikolai of the Illuminati, 1733 to 1811, who is recorded in most reference works simply as Nikolai. In 1757, before the Illuminati was established, he founded, with Mendelssohn, the Bibliothek der Schönen Wissenschaften, or the Library of Fine Philosophy, which was a periodical devoted to philosophy. Nikolai, who was at the center of the Illuminati's anti-religious activism, was also involved in other literary projects with Mendelssohn well before the founding of the Illuminati. Together with Lessing, they had founded the Brief die Neueste Literatur betreffend, which was a brief concerning the newest literature, 1759. Nikolai was editor from 1765 to 1792 of the Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliothek, which was a philosophical periodical. Of the Bibliothek, the Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that the Bibliothek served as the organ of the so-called popular philosophers who warred against authority and religion. Mendelssohn naturally was one of the contributors to the Bibliothek. Indeed, the relationship of Nikolai and Mendelssohn was so close that Nikolai inherited all of Mendelssohn's original writings, written correspondence, and notes after his death in 1786. From Robeson's account, we know that it was Nikolai's function, with the codename Lucian, to undermine religion. Mendelssohn fits nicely into the Illuminati picture, so much so that we know he was an enthusiast of Plato, being dubbed after the publication of his Phaedon, 1767, which was modeled after Plato's dialogue Phaedo as the German Plato. There seems to be a conscious attempt when one reads Jewish scholarly writings to hide this. For example, in the B'nai B'rith-sponsored biography of Mendelssohn, Alfred Josp says that Mendelssohn was called the Jewish Plato. One can only wonder if there is not indeed a cover-up here to prevent the identification of Mendelssohn with the Illuminati. Perhaps one of the most damning statements that could reflect on Mendelssohn in this capacity is Robeson's reference to Socratism as identical with Illuminatism and the fact that Mendelssohn was also called the German Socrates. Perhaps one could argue this is but a minor error on Josp's part, except why does the author, who is a prominent B'nai B'rith Hillel executive, refer to Nikolai as Frederick Nikolai when the latter's full name is Christopher Frederick? And why does he propagandize and write in glowing terms about Mendelssohn when clearly Mendelssohn's impact on Judaism was more of a curse than a blessing? Mendelssohn fits the Illuminati pattern very well. By only criticizing Jewish dogma and still firmly maintaining the authenticity of Jewish observance, Mendelssohn is subtly advocating the gradual overthrow of Judaism. By putting Judaism on strictly logical grounds and ignoring its transcendental, emotional, and gut reaction aspects, Mendelssohn accepts one of the avowed goals of the Illuminati to substitute reason for religious faith. Mendelssohn thus joins the army of hired writers referred to by Robeson, who were part of the systematic Illuminati conspiracy against religion. However, what is not too well known is that even more than engaging in writing, Mendelssohn trained disciples for the French Revolution. Mirabeau's relationship then with Mendelssohn, and even writing about Mendelssohn, was not merely an accident or an act of sentiment. One of Mendelssohn's disciples, who was a Jacobin, was another Maskell named Zelkind Horowitz, 1740 to 1812. An interesting point is brought up in the careers of both Nikolai and Mendelssohn, as well as with Nige, who was also tied in with Nikolai and Mendelssohn. Apparently, these kindred spirits harbored revolutionary thoughts long before there was an organization for them to implement these thoughts into action. The Illuminati provided not only the organizational structure for action, but also a milieu for those people to engage in an organized conspiracy. For we know that when kindred spirits unite under the name of an organization, evils that an individual may just contemplate can be put into action, and that groups will not hesitate to effectuate what a single individual has hesitations about. Peretz Smolenskin, 1842 to 1885, the great Hebraist, was acute enough to perceive that there was some kind of connection between Mendelssohn and the Reform movement. Smolenskin was a staunch critic of Reform Judaism and the Haskalah. David Philipson, 1862, who was one of the leaders of the American Reform movement, did not quote Smolenskin by name, but in his book, The Reform Movement in Judaism, he takes to task those who frequently spoke of Mendelssohn as an originator of the Reform movement. While it appears that Philipson knew of the connections between the Bundegerechten and the Reformers, apparently he knew nothing about the Illuminati influence or connection with Reform, so he cannot see the continuum of Mendelssohn to Reform. He thus says that Mendelssohn made the Reform movement possible by giving the impulse to modern education among Jews, but a religious reformer he was not. Philipson goes on to say, quite the contrary, he conformed strictly to every requirement and demand of Rabbinical Judaism. His conception of Judaism was that it was a divine legislation, that since the ceremonial law was revealed by God, it has potency and must be observed until it shall be repealed by another revelation. End quote. It is rather interesting to see that for Philipson, a devout advocate for the revolutionary overthrow of Jewish values, Mendelssohn is too religious a personality for him to swallow, which again bears out how insidious the Illuminati were in advocating creeping changes in religion. Smolenskin's evaluation is more perceptive because he sees through the thin veil of Mendelssohn quite clearly. Even Christian writers immediately saw in the publication of Mendelssohn's Jerusalem that if Judaism had no dogmas but only laws, it was no religion but only a political system. Schrechter, Geiger's disciple, over 100 years after Mendelssohn, also who was a tool of the communist conspiracy, decided he could even capitalize on this when he wrote an essay entitled The Dogma of the Dogmalessness, in which he takes people such as Mendelssohn to task for claiming that Judaism has no dogmas. With such writings, Schrechter hoped to gather around him and to find an attraction for more religious groups of Jews who would be enticed into further enlightenment. The question that remains is it possible to be a Jew and ignore dogma? In the structure of Judaism, there are among the 613 commandments of the Torah, philosophical commandments. Judaism is structured so that if a person were to mentally reject God or the dogma that the Torah is of divine authority, that several Jewish laws will be violated, including prohibitions of idolatry and blasphemy, as for example in the book of Numbers, where it is stated in chapter 15, verse 31 that, quote, if a person has spurned the word of the Lord, that person should be cut off from his people. End quote. This means that to deny one word of the Torah as being of divine origin makes one culpable for this sin. Judaism does not differentiate between agnosticism and atheism. To deny God's Torah is to deny God. Furthermore, the rabbis decreed that concerning 3 cardinal sins is death to be preferred over life. They are idolatry, prohibited sexual intercourse, and murder of an innocent person. In defining idolatry, the rabbis delineated certain philosophical commandments which fell under this category. The rabbis did not regard Christians, for example, as idolaters, for it had been well articulated in Judaism that the concept of the Trinity is not idolatrous for a non-Jew, since non-Jews were never given any specific commandments prohibiting belief in a multifaceted deity. However, with regard to the Jew, the Torah proclaims in Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Judaism regarded the commandment to unify God as a commandment to be binding exclusively on Jews. Therefore, Jews throughout the Middle Ages chose death rather than forced conversion to Christianity. Judaism officially regarded Christians as not being idolatrous, but Jews who converted to Christianity are considered as idolaters. The Muslim philosophers declared that the Torah was not an authentic revelation, but their religion spoke of one God, Allah. Again, Judaism regarded the denial of the authentic revelation of the Torah by Islam as non-idolatrous, for non-Jews were not included in the commandments concerning the blasphemy of the Torah. For the Jews, this would be idolatry. Therefore, they chose death rather than to convert to Islam. Judaism is a non-proselytizing faith and therefore has no missionaries. For intrinsic in the belief in Judaism was that non-Jews could achieve salvation if they led moral lives. In Talmudic verbiage, the righteous of the world have a share in the hereafter. And it was conceived that the Jew was to be a priesthood to serve the nations of the world to achieve a moral life based on universal morality as conceived in the Noahide laws. Ironically, we find that Judaism has more in common with Christianity than the new ideology which Mendelssohn was seeking to force upon Judaism. Both Christianity and Judaism hold that there was an authentic revelation at Mount Sinai. The difference of opinion between the two religions was whether this revelation was supplemented. Judaism maintains that the revelation was binding for all time, and Christianity maintains that it was supplemented and changed at a later date. Hence the term New Testament adopted by Christianity, which was supposed to supplant the Old Testament, a term which the believing Jew could never accept. What Mendelssohn was trying to foster were concepts which would undermine the dogmatic foundation of Judaism, so much so that one could maintain that he denied the divine revelation of the Torah and still be called a Jew. Mendelssohn was playing religious hide-and-go-seek. He was addressing himself to the semi-educated classes of Jews. He was saying that the ceremonial laws were revealed and that the philosophical laws were not, while anyone who was well-grounded in Jewish law knew that there was an entire body of Jewish laws called the Hilchot Deot, laws dealing with concepts and philosophies such as the love of God, his existence, repentance, revelation, humility, etc. Mendelssohn became an object of derision among the rabbis who would not cease from castigating him. Smolenskin considers Mendelssohn as a central figure for revolution. In his Hatoa Bedarki Hakayim, or He Who Errs in the Ways of Life, he refers to him as, quote, "He was a merchant and not a rabbi, and neither was he well learned in Jewish studies. As a merchant, he sold his people and his faith. Publicly, he embraced everything, and secretly he gave everything away for nothing." End quote. Mendelssohn was a con artist of the first order. He was telling the Jews to move out of the ghetto only by acquiring the culture of the country, but he was implying that the culture of the country was incompatible with authentic Judaism and philosophy. For centuries, Sephardic Jews had not known of a ghetto and had acquired the culture of their country and had produced men who, in their lifetime, had succeeded in keeping synthesized the scientific with the religious without contradiction. Some of the great role models of this religious cultural community were the great Spanish, Portuguese, Jewish philosophers who included the great physician, philosopher, and rabbinical authority Maimonides, Gersonides, pioneer in the development of navigational instruments, a noted astronomer and biblical commentator, and Nachmanides. All that was now needed for some successful movement to paint the picture that a cultured individual cannot be religious, as Geiger was successful in doing, and two things could happen. Jews could become irreligious and cultured, or they could be steadfastly religious and withdrawn from society around them and become so paralyzed as to be rendered useless in their impact upon general society. Unfortunately, entire communities of Jews were so suspicious of culture and secularism as a result of what Mendelssohn began that they raised entire generations in a strict parochial environment, to such an extent that they erroneously conceived the Torah study should be taught pure without any higher secular education. This view still persists among some Jews today who refuse to send their children to college. Unfortunately, the success of the Marxist ideological secular conspiracy has been so great that even the Christian community has proliferated in recent years many of its own schools of higher education, such as Ambassador College and Bob Jones University, where they could insulate their young people from radical ideologies and immorality. What those Jews who adopted the isolationist stance to secular culture were doing was actually catapulting to what Mendelssohn, the Illuminati, and Bund and Marxists wanted them to do all along. They were, through withdrawal, bowing out of sight and contact with the real world, and thus the elimination of the opiate and the overthrow of religion could be accomplished that much more quickly. Perhaps the greatest single voice against this conspiracy was the Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a contemporary of Abraham Geiger, who fought successfully these machinations by adopting the philosophy of Torah im Derech Fretz, or Torah and culture. Thus, the followers of S.R. Hirsch brought up their children to excel in fields of secular endeavor and in religious observance. However, Hirsch's approach lacked mystical elements. This attitude was also adopted by many communities in Eastern Europe who trained their children in the Haskalah and educated them in literature and pointed out the pitfalls of surrendering eternal and authentic religious values to the Haskalah. The varied attitudes of this subject and a philosophy of approach were causes of a bitter contention between some Hasidic dynasties. The Munkach dynasty of Hungary, for example, condemned any pursuit of secular education and urged an iconoclastic existence upon its members. The Lubavitch sect urged complete intellectual immersion in Western culture with no compromise whatsoever upon Torah values, but it encouraged some of its students, if they so desired, not to pursue a university education. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, had a PhD degree and engaged in dialogue with university professors and college students, holding official intellectual colloquia with them in his Brooklyn headquarters. Another Hasidic group which chagrined the Assimilationists was the Reisener dynasty. The Reisener group was founded by Rabbi Israel Friedman of Reisen. His son Abraham founded another dynasty in Galicia, the dynasty of Sadegir. Sadegir had been described as an unusual combination of high mysticism, high living, messianism, high fashion, and a splendid regal way of life. Yeshiva University in New York City is one of the great institutions which keeps alive the notion of the synthesis of cultural secular values with authentic Jewish practice. It is interesting to note on this score how the writer Chaim Potok, in his book The Chosen, refers to his fictitious university, which really is Yeshiva University. He calls it Samson R. Hirsch University because in essence it is this school which carries on the heritage and teachings of Rabbi Samson R. Hirsch. In his manner popularizing the concept that the philosophical and ethical teachings of Judaism are those of reason and hence universal, Mendelssohn was paving the way for the supremacy of reason over the spiritual emotional involvements with Torah and Judaism. This could eventually force the breakdown of religious differentiations. The Illuminati had not only wanted reason to take the place of religious authority, but wanted Christians to gradually become atheists. It is interesting to note, as we pointed out before, that Judaism, which has no missionaries, did not change its views concerning non-Jews who worship the Trinity. However, one does not have to be too brilliant to realize that a religious Christian who did become a pure monotheist could be so cut off from his heritage and its authoritarian hold upon him that he could eventually erode his religious convictions to atheism. The type of philosophy was even sold in later years to Jewish immigrants who were in effect told to melt into this great melting pot of America by throwing off the religious way of life. What in reality happened was that a way of life was being sold to these immigrants as the American way of life, when it was nothing more than Mendelssohn's assimilation. As for Mendelssohn's goal to establish Judaism as only a religion and the concept of loyalty to it as compatible with a national state, let us consider the following. To the religious personality, his religion is a unique way of life. However, in telling such a person that his religion was just another religion alongside many others, the religious personality is diminished. This is called comparative religion. In fostering such studies, one could eventually lose respect for his own religion and regard it as another religion among the religions of the world. Loyalty to the national state, according to Mendelssohn, could only be achieved when faiths were regarded as religions and not as ways of life. It was conceived that in years to come, the Platonic order would increasingly become the way of life of the world. As this evolved, it would be necessary for the state to demand the surrender of religious values in the name of the state. When Mendelssohn was writing about the separation of church and state in his Jerusalem, What he really meant was eventual subversion of the church to the state and not separation. Under such a system, adultery could be tolerated, abortion would be commended, and homosexuals would prosper. It is interesting to note that under Napoleon, the compatibility of Judaism with the state was translated into action. Napoleon convened a court of Jewish law, a Sanhedrin of Jewish leaders, in 1807, consisting of 80 delegates, 46 of whom were rabbis. They affirmed that Jews could participate in all professions, and while rabbis could not officiate at mixed marriages, the decision of civil courts had priority over religious courts. This meant that mixed marriages that were prohibited according to Jewish law between Jews and non-Jews would be foisted upon Jewish communities against their will. One may now justly ask, is there evidence that Mendelssohn was really thinking in terms of Platonic society? And if this is true, how do you explain the fact that Mendelssohn was supposed to be a religious Jew in his private life? The answer to these questions is that Mendelssohn was extremely interested in Plato and that his so-called religious observances were nothing more than a facade because of the 6 children that he fathered, all converted to Christianity after his death, except for 2. But now let us turn to some of the documents of these occurrences. The most comprehensive book on Mendelssohn ever appearing in print is one that has just been published in 1973 by Professor Alexander Altman of Brandeis University entitled Moses Mendelssohn, A Biographical Study. This 900-page work, which is an unusual tribute to Dr. Altman and his thorough research, contains a fantastic amount of comprehensive information on Mendelssohn. Dr. Altman has traveled to Germany to obtain some original manuscripts with regard to Moses Mendelssohn and his life. Of particular interest to us is the collection of letters and notes from Moses Mendelssohn, which Dr. Altman refers to as the Marburg File. The Marburg File is a collection of letters and notes from Mendelssohn and Nicolai, which was discovered during the 1930s in Marburg. From this file, much can be gathered concerning the relationship of Nicolai and Mendelssohn. We learn from a letter which Mendelssohn sent on July 5, 1763, to Isaac Iselin that he had translated 3 books of Plato's Republic into German. Nicolai was quite enthusiastic about publishing this translation. In our previous discussions, we touched briefly on the Schiff-Rothschild interrelationships and members of the Bund der Gerechten. Max Warburg, for example, ran the M.N. Warburg Company in Frankfurt and was a major financier of the Bolshevik Revolution. His bank financed Adolf Hitler. His brother Paul married Nina Loeb, daughter of Solomon Loeb of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. The other brother, Felix, married Frieda Schiff, Jacob Schiff's daughter. Incidentally, the Schiffs and Rothschilds shared a double house in Frankfurt. What is rather significant, as implied by Altman, is that the translation of Plato's Republic was never published. If this was the case, then for whom was it prepared? Was it prepared for the Illuminati? Altman, in a footnote, says of the fragments of Mendelssohn's translation, they are in the possession of Mr. Eric Warburg, who kindly placed photocopies of them at my disposal. Eric Warburg is the surviving son of Max Warburg. Is it mere coincidence that Eric Warburg should be the heir of this translation, or is it a hand-me-down from the Illuminati? It is interesting to note that long before Mendelssohn ever conceived of translating the Torah into German, the Republic was on his mind. Was it because Mendelssohn considered its communist blueprint far more important than the Torah? How did the Mendelssohn-Nicolai relationship evolve? In a letter written in May of 1756 by Mendelssohn to Lessing, he states, "I have tried to rid myself of as many old acquaintances as possible, except for Professor Sulzer and Herr Nicolai." The letter states as follows: "For the time being, I have become unfaithful to meditative Grubelenden metaphysics. I visit the Herr Nicolai very often in his garden. I truly love him, dearest friend, and I believe that our friendship will thereby gain, because in him I love your true friend. We read poems. Herr Nicolai declaims to me his own work. I sit in judgment as a critic, admire, laugh, censure until nightfall. Then we once more remember you and part company, contented with our day's work. I'm making a fairly good start towards becoming a bel esprit." That's like a smart person. "Who knows whether one day I shall not write verse? Madame Metaphysics may forgive me. She asserts that friendship rests on the identity of people's inclinations, and I find that, on the contrary, identity of inclinations may, in reverse, rest on friendship. Your friendship and Nikolai's has tempted me to withdraw part of my love from the venerable matron and to give it to the belle lettrée. Our friendship has even elected me as a contributor to his bibliothèque, but I am afraid that his choice will prove an unfortunate one. The garden of which Mendelssohn speaks of is located in Spenderstrasse 68. Nikolai occupied it from 1755 to 1757, and Mendelssohn made this address his residence from 1762 until his death. It is interesting to note that Mendelssohn did not translate Plato until after he met Nikolai. It is also interesting to note that Altmann calls attention to a change that may have come about in the life of Carl Friedrich Barth, 1741 to 1792, who was active in the Illuminati. The change that took place in Barth's life is reflected in some passages in Altmann's book. Apparently, before the Illuminati was formed, Barth was a conservative, believing Christian. He was mostly disturbed by Mendelssohn. In his The True Christian in Solitude, he accused the Berlin Academy around 1761 of having gotten Mendelssohn to attack the Christian religion. Nearly 2 years after the formation of the Illuminati, the March 17, 1778 issue of the Freiwillige Betrage, published in Hamburg, carried an article by Johann M. Goes accusing Lessing's atheistic theological writings to be those of a notorious Carl Friedrich Barth, against whom the Imperial Court Council in Vienna has begun to take action. Lessing was a close colleague of Mendelssohn. G.H.G. von Giusti, 1705 to 1761, one of the fathers of political science in Germany, denounced the literature brief of Nikolai, Lessing, and Mendelssohn, and because of these charges, the literature brief were notoriously put on the censor's index on March 17th of 1762. However, the ban was lifted a few days later. As for the attempts described by Robinson of the Illuminati to subvert the Freemasons in Germany, Altmann further makes mention that when Lessing spent time in Berlin in the early part of 1776, he discusses his theory of the origin of the Freemasons with Nikolai, who was an eminent expert in this field, and Nikolai in turn frequently discussed it with Mendelssohn. Altmann states categorically that Mendelssohn had never made an effort to enter the order. It may be possible that at this point Mendelssohn had no idea that Lessing and Nikolai were in the process of attempting to subvert the Freemasons to the aims of the Illuminati. If the Platonic state were to reign supreme, then perhaps the first area that would break down in practical ceremonial Jewish law would be the process of excommunication. The rules of excommunication in Jewish law state that if a Beit Din, which is a duly constituted court of Jewish law, summons one to appear before it, and he fails to appear, he could be excommunicated. If, as some people alleged, Mendelssohn was such a stickler about practical observances, why did he then write the following piece in regards to excommunication, which literally breaks the back of rabbinical authority? He writes, in accordance with it, the principle of the separation of church membership and citizenship, the civil authorities should never permit a rabbi to pronounce against a member of his community such a ban as excludes him from all social contact with the rest of his coreligionists outside the synagogue, degrades him in their eyes, interferes with him in his business, or even exposes him to persecution by the mob. It appears that fines imposed for transgressing presumed commandments from heaven are likewise improper. The wrong use of a power imposing these penalties that can make, and in fact has often been made by rabbis, makes it necessary for the government to keep the exercise of this power under constant supervision. When punishing the Jew who is a transgressor, the power must never punish the man and the citizen. Nothing but exclusion from ecclesiastical society and its benefits should follow from a violation of its precepts. Dr. M.C. Weinberger, in his Sefer V'Sayef, or Book and Sword, records some of the rabbinical polemics against Mendelssohn's wire, which emanated from such notables as Rabbi Ezekiel Landau. Weinberger is astonished as to why the rabbis would object to Mendelssohn's translation of the Torah when it was known that Sadiah Gaon, 882 to 942, translated the Torah into Arabic. Actually, the rabbinical leadership knew that Mendelssohn was a conspirator, and they understood what he was up to. In their own manner, they went around condemning Mendelssohn indirectly, for they feared that direct accusations of Mendelssohn could lead to recriminations and persecution of their people, especially since it was rather clear to them that both Frederick II in Germany and Joseph II in Austria, as well as other monarchs under whom the Jews were living, were involved with these Illuminati. They moved about very cautiously and very circumspect in their criticism so as not to cause any friction between the ruling powers and members of the Jewish community. Of Mendelssohn's 8 children, 5 were boys and 3 were girls. The 3 boys surviving him were Joseph, Abraham, and Nathan. One son by the name of Chaim died in infancy, February 19th to April 3rd, 1766, and another son, Mendel, died when he was 6 in 1775. Eisenstein and Josp state that all the children except one, Joseph, converted to Christianity, while Altman and EJ say that all the children except 2 resisted conversion. Altman and EJ are correct. One daughter, Dorothy, left her first husband, a Jewish banker, Simon Veit, to marry the Romantic poet Schlegel. She first turned Protestant and then Catholic. Another daughter, Henrietta, turned Catholic after her mother died in 1812. The famous composer Felix Mendelssohn, 1809 to 1847, was the son of Abraham, who converted in 1822. Felix was so ashamed of his Jewish ancestry that he tried to have his last name changed, only to discover, ironically, that people were flocking to his concerts because of the memory of his illustrious grandfather. One may ask whether Mendelssohn, who had been set up as a role model, could have planned the conversion of his children as part of a conspiracy after his death. If one knew these groups well, it is not so far-fetched to believe that this is a possibility. One can well ask, wouldn't his wife do anything to stop the initial conversion from happening? Apparently she may have done nothing, for she was of the Guggenheim family, which was part of the inner circle of the Bund, and may also have supported the Illuminati in its time. She was also tutored by Bode of the Illuminati. We have noted that the followers of Rabbi S.R. Hirsch were able to partially foil the Haskalah in Germany. However, his formulation of Torah and culture was lacking a mystical element which could have been more conducive to further success. Why did it lack the mystical element? Mendelssohn's impact on German Jewry was so great that by the time Rabbi Hirsch came on the scene, it was virtually impossible to introduce mystical elements into religious creed for fear that they would be considered as superstition. It was only in the 1930s that Hirsch's grandson, Rabbi Isaac Brewer, finally attempted to officially inject the mystical element into the theology of observant Hirschian school German Jews. This is discussed by Professor Scholem in a chapter entitled The Politics of Mysticism, Isaac Brewer's New Kuzari, of his The Messianic Idea in Judaism. Rabbi Ezekiel Landau's public pronouncements against Mendelssohn, together with that of others, gathered momentum, and in the halls of learning throughout Germany and Europe, Mendelssohn's name and family became a subject of derision and a curse. It is both to the deep prophetic insights and foresight of the rabbis that they already predicted over 150 years before the actual events that a Holocaust was going to fall upon the Jewish people. They cited the Talmud in Tractate Sotah, which asks the question as to why Samson's eyes were blinded in the city of Gaza. Samson's corruption began in Gaza. Therefore, he was punished in Gaza, as it is written in Judges 16:1. And Samson went to Gaza and saw there was a whore. Therefore, he was punished in Gaza, as it is written. And the Philistines seized him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. The rabbis compared Mendelssohn and his Berlin circle to the whore and warned that if Israel were to be tempted by Berlin, then the destruction of Israel would come from Berlin, and so it was. Mendelssohn was readily accepted by those who considered themselves the vanguard of the new era. Professor Gershom Scholem states that the followers of Shabbatai Zvi and Jacob Frank enthusiastically ran after Mendelssohn. Indeed, Scholem further states that these people intended to use the Haskalah for their own Sabbatian ends. According to Scholem, quote, the leaders of the school of Mendelssohn, who were neither Sabbatians themselves, of course, nor under the influence of mysticism at all, to say nothing of mystical heresy, found ready recruits for their cause in Sabbatian circles, where the world of Rabbinic Judaism had already been completely destroyed from within, quite independently of the efforts of secularist criticism. Those who had survived the ruin were now open to any alternative or wind of change, and so their mad visions behind them, they turned their energies and hidden desires for a more positive life to assimilation and the Haskalah, two forces that accomplished without paradoxes, indeed without religion at all, what they, the members of the accursed sect, had earnestly striven for in a stormy contention with truth, carried on in a half-light of a faith pregnant with paradoxes. End quote. A rather interesting custom started to spread like a plague in Mendelssohn's time from the Illuminati and Haskalah, and became a practice among the early Reform. This was pressure to place a symbol of illumination into synagogues throughout the world, unbeknownst to the masses. It is stated in the book of Exodus that God commands the children of Israel to take pure olive oil to make a continuous light. This is what appears in the Hebrew text as Ner Tamid. The eternal light was kept up in both temples in Jerusalem. However, with the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersion of Jewry, the practice was discontinued. There were some synagogues that continued the custom of maintaining an eternal light on the western side of the synagogue, opposing the ark. In the 18th century, the practice of placing the eternal light in the synagogue was observed among Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese Jews who placed the Ner Tamid on the western wall of their synagogues. Ashkenazic Jewry and the Eastern European Hasidic Jews did not have a Ner Tamid in their synagogues. They felt that the Ner Tamid was to be held in reserve for the future restoration of the temple. The Enlighteners started to push the practice of introducing the Ner Tamid to be on the eastern wall of the synagogue, right in front of the ark where the Torah is held. The Torah commentary of Rabbi Samson R. Hirsch makes mention that the eternal light symbolizes illumination and the clarity of the mind. However, he was aware of what was going on, for he states further in his commentary, quote, the human mind, turning towards the Torah and receiving enlightenment from the Torah, has constantly to be kept conscious that it stands outside the Torah. The Torah is something that has been given to it, not produced by it. It has to draw and increase its knowledge and enlightenment out of the Torah, but never take its own light into the realm of the Torah to alter or reform it. It has always to keep itself conscious of the covering, and should the need arise, to preserve it against any tendency of the human mind, which, misjudging in its true position, could turn against the inviolability of the Torah, and instead of sitting as a disciple at the feet of the Torah, dare to assume an arrogant mastery over it. End quote. Yes, Hirsch understood only too well what was being done, and he knew what illumination meant in his day and what it was to become. We shall now turn our attention to the Frankists, co-conspirators of the Illuminati, Reform, and Haskalah. Chapter 10 is the Dobrushka, the Red Kabbalah, and the Jacobins.